Namaste and welcome to the 10 p.m. show on Wednesday. And today we are going to have this talk in the backdrop of all the debate that is going around the temple reclamation that is going on, whether it is Kashi or it is Mathura or it is Qutub Minar or whatever. And the other day, some things were discovered in Mangalore too. So we've got Dr. Koenraad Elst with us, and the Jaipur Dialogues, Jaipur Dialogues viewers are familiar with Dr. Koenraad Elst. Just to remind you that he is a very old hat in this entire debate. He's seen it all during the Ayodhya movement, and he's written on the Ayodhya movement. He's written on the negationism in India. He's also written on decolonizing the Indian mind. So there's no better person, I think, who can throw light on this. Dr. Elst, welcome to Jaipur Dialogues once again. And of course, Shri Vibhuti Jha, as always on Wednesday, 10 p.m. show. Dr. Elst, you see what is going on the Gyanvapi issue, on the Mathura issue. And for once, the Hindus have got their legal arsenal correct. And they have kind of put the Islamists on the mat in the sense that Ayodhya project, you've seen it all. And I think that was also probably the reason why the resistance in Ayodhya was so fierce, because they knew that if Ayodhya they could lose, then Kashi and Mathura, the evidence is right on the ground. It's right for there for everybody to see. So they're attacking this on two fronts. The first one, of course, is that everyone who came to India uh, is an invader. So India is basically a dharamshala. So it just doesn't have a culture of its own. Everything is a melting pot, sort of, what you hear in the Americas. And therefore, any blame that is being put on the doors of the invaders, on the doors of the Islamic kings, is actually hyperventilation kind of a thing. So that's the first argument that is being put up. So what would you say to that? And of course, you've seen it during Ayodhya. They did that that time as well.
Yes, of the three main contentious sides, the case of Ayodhya was in fact the um, the most challenging for the Hindu side, in the sense that there the proof um, was, only gradually compiled. In fact, there was already proof enough beforehand, and there was even a consensus, including also the local Muslim community, that the Babri Masjid had been built on top of a Hindu temple. And so there really was no controversy until in the late 80s, the eminent historians created. And then when Hindu scholars set their mind to collecting even more evidence, they did so, a lot of documentary evidence, and also the definitive archaeological evidence. So in the case of Ayodhya, ultimately the existence of the temple did get proven, and all the eminent historians who are still alive now keep silent about it because they know they have been found out. Many of them also have been called to court in Uttar Pradesh in the year about 2005 and fallen through really embarrassing, saying, "Oh, but I'm not an archaeologist. Oh, but I've never been to Ayodhya." He confessing that they had only signed the anti-temple statement because everybody else around them. And so the authority which these eminent historians ought to have brought to their case really was imagined. And so now you see their Ayodhya case has fallen through completely. and they won't repeat it in the case of Kashi or Mathura. Also, because if there could have been any doubt in the case of Ayodhya, there is simply no scope for doubt in the case of both Kashi and Mathura. You see,
Dr. Else, we are losing your voice. You're losing your voice. So,
Again?
yeah.
okay.
So in the case of Ayodhya, for example, there must have existed a testimony by Babar himself about what he did when he was in Ayodhya. Unfortunately, that part of his diary has been lost, which he himself describes in a later part of his diary. So in the case of Kashi and of Mathura, we have, first of all, several successive demolitions, and each of them has actually been described, mostly by the perpetrators, sometimes also in Hindu testimonies. And so there it's so obvious. Also, the archaeology is obvious. In the case of Kashi, well, the mosque actually contains a lot of the temple walls that belong to the temple that was demolished for it. So you see, about the facts of the case, there is no doubt at all. Ayodhya was demolished probably 3 different times, Mathura and Kashi even more. At any rate, they were demolished by Islamic iconoclasm. About that, there is no doubt at all. So now, of course, the enemy camp is trying new tactics. And so one of them is exactly, as you say, to claim that, first of all, everybody was an invader. And secondly, that Hindus have done pretty much the same thing. As for invader, this is not really relevant. Of course, about the so-called Aryan Invasion Theory, I also have done a lot of work and I have very precise positions. But I wouldn't want to go into that in the sense that whether Hindus were invaders or not is not at issue here, because it's not being an invader that makes you a temple destroyer. You see, the Greeks, for example, have invaded. Now, what happened? You see, Heliodorus became a Krishna worshipper. He had this Heliodorus pillar for Krishna erected in Sanchi thereabouts. Or, for instance, Menander, Milinda in Sanskrit, became a Buddhist and had this classic Milinda Panya written. So these invaders actually integrated into Hindu society and contributed to Hindu civilization. The Scythians integrated, becoming the Rajputs. The Huns integrated. The Kushanas very much contributed to Buddhist culture. Kanishka called the Buddhist Council and so on. The British, who did lots of things wrong, who, dislocated the Indian economy, the Indian education system, and so on, nevertheless didn't destroy temples, and in fact contributed a lot to the rediscovery of ancient Sanskrit literature, rediscovering ancient texts like the Arthashastra, for example, started archaeologically researching the existing monuments and so on. So they did not destroy temples. If Babar destroyed a temple in Ayodhya, it is not because he was an invader. It's because of some other quality that he had. And so I prefer not even to go into the question of the Aryan invasion. I mean, not when we're talking about this topic of temple destruction.
Right. And in fact, now you're working on the out of India theory, so that
Yes.
Aryan invasion theory is now left far behind.
Then there is the second part of your question about Hindus doing much the same. Okay. So on the one hand, we have thousands of proven cases of Islamic destruction of Hindu temples. On the other hand, we do have a few cases of Buddhist monuments now turned into Hindu temples. Mostly Buddhism becomes Shaivism. And so the prime example is the Mahabodhi temple at the site where the Buddha reached his awakening. Now, what's the story of that temple? The Buddhists were collectively annihilated, mostly in 1194, when the Buddhist universities were destroyed. The Buddhist monks were also leveled together with their institutions. And so Buddhism, unlike Brahmanism, was very concentrated in these institutions. So as soon as these institutions went, there was no living Buddhism anymore. Now, in spite of all their destroying, there were a few Buddhist monuments which they left standing, not because they chose not to destroy them, but simply because they were out of the way of the itinerary of the Islamic armies. And so in the forest, you had this Mahabodhi temple, which was standing empty. There were no Buddhists to run it anymore. It had a certain Shaiva connection. In fact, many Buddhist temples had Shiva or Ganesha statues inside them, or used as doorkeepers or so, whatever. To Hindus, it was obvious that this had a Shiva connection, so they started using it as a Shiva temple. And so the proper Buddhist attitude would be to be grateful to the Hindus for having kept their main temple alive, rather than being angry for Hindus having stolen this temple. No, they're not stolen, they have kept it nicely. And it is only correct that there are some Shaivas on the governing board of that temple. So there are indeed cases of Buddhist temples having been turned into Hindu temples, just as there are cases of temples devoted to one particular Hindu god turned into temples for a different god. But you see, that's a totally different thing from trying to destroy Buddhism. You see, in the case of Buddhism, well, Buddhism had been destroyed, and Hindus had to make do with what little was left over of it. Now, another very related case is that of idol abduction. There are a few cases in most pagan cultures, in most polytheist, idolatrous cultures, and there are, for instance, very many of them in Mesopotamia, but there are also a few in Hindu history of idols being abducted. Now, that's a totally different thing from temple and idol destruction. You see, when an idol gets abducted, it is not an attack on the religion around the idol, or of which the idol is a representative. On the contrary, you see, you go to you have a war with some neighboring king. You win the war, you enter his capital, you go to the main temple, and you take the, let's say, Shiva statue that is standing there, and you take it home with you in triumph, and you install it with all pomp and circumstance in your own main temple. And there you continue the worship of Shiva. And in the place belonging to your adversary, they are perfectly free to install a new Shiva statue. Maybe they have to make a new one, or they have to install another one that they already have. But at any rate, they simply continue the Shiva worship that existed. So there is no infraction into the existing Shiva cultus. And so that's a radical difference with the Islamic iconoclasm, which meant to physically represent the deeper project of destroying the infidel religion. You see, when the statues of the Kashi Vishwanath or Krishna or let's say Somnath, when they were destroyed, they were not taken home and installed in the main mosque in Delhi or in Mecca or so. On the contrary, sometimes they were thrown to pieces, but the pieces still kept alive because they were then masoned into the lavatories close to the mosque, or they were masoned in the footpath so that all the Muslims would have the joy of trampling on the pagan gods. And so that's a totally different scenario from what happened in the case of idol abduction. It is typical for the extreme, for the willful superficiality of secularism, that they mix these two. And perhaps that superficiality is understandable in that sense that most secularists have in their personal lives lost interest in religion and don't know much about religion. And so they are very vague in making these comparisons because they don't understand what is really going on. They have lost this feeling for religion. Others perhaps have more feeling for religion, like practicing Muslims, for instance. And in their case, it may be a willful, attempt to deceive. I mean, I don't want to judge the motives why people utter these mistaken beliefs, this completely mistaken comparison. But at any rate, I want to affirm that that comparison is completely unjustified.
Right, quite right. Vibhuti Ji, you have questions?
Yes, my question relates to the temple thing that you talked about. I'm as we learn more about history, we get to know more about the truth. But we also know that the detractors or the people who oppose this, they instituted laws. They have been planning and plotting for a very long time. Look at this entire Gyanvapi thing. The temple, the place of worship act comes into play, and now the justices are operating on the basis of existing law. There has been a lot of conversation on this matter. So what my concern is that how does one handle that? Because our enemies were very clear in doing what they wanted to do, and they planned, plotted, schemed, and implemented. Why is the Hindu mind always so benign that we take it for granted that everything will be fine? Insofar as temples are concerned, I do not even want to go into the historical evidence. Every temple that has been demolished has a superstructure, and then the OIT comes into play, or the AIT comes into play, that we were already here. We didn't do anything. We just conquered, and that's the dichotomy that I'm having. And in the current situation, that why are we avoiding the bleeding obvious? If the law is there, what needs to be done to undo the law, which we know that was done viciously with an only intent to protect X, harm Y?
Well, about the background of that law, I wouldn't be so outspoken. You see, it emanated from the then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, and he was a mysterious man, and his reasons for enacting this law are still not 100% clear to me. He was rather in favor of the Ayodhya temple. And that's, of course, why he allowed the Karsevaks to continue with their demolition. He could have sent in the army to stop the demolition, and he chose not to do that. And so, if you want to have the temple built, at some point you will have to demolish the structure that was standing there. Now, this had become a very hot potato. The eminent historians had seen to that. In the 1980s, Rajiv Gandhi was planning to have the temple built, and he was also busy buying off the Muslim leadership with sweeteners for them, like the Shah Bano case, like the prohibition of Salman Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses. So he was trying to work out some deal, so typical Congress side horse trading. You see some presents for the Hindus, some for the Muslims, and ultimately, everybody will be happy, or at least happy enough not to cause any trouble. That's not a very principled way to go about it. It's typically Congress side, but it had the virtue of hopefully being bloodless. And so that far Raji was going. He even sent his home minister, Bhutta Singh, to the Shilanyas ceremony, the laying of the first stone of the prospective temple in 1989. But then came the letter by the eminent historians that totally demonized the whole idea of a temple there. And it made the Babri Masjid into some kind of mecca of secularism, the last holdout of secularism. And so now suddenly, all those who publicly swore by secularism, including most Congress politicians, felt uneasy with the idea of this whole temple. So that's when the temple project passed from Congress to the BJP. And that's also when Narasingha Rao then thought of, the necessity to push back the BJP, because the BJP was greatly profiting from the issue. It won 2 successive elections in 89 and 91, going from 2 seats in parliament to becoming the largest opposition party. So BJP was going very strong. And so Narasingha Rao, when he became the prime minister, calculated that allowing the demolition would kill 2 birds with 1 stone. It would finally make way for the temple. Nobody anymore dared to demolish it, not the BJP either. The BJP leaders tried to stop the Karsevaks from their demolition. Even many VHP leaders like Ashok Singhal tried to do so. I may by now, I suppose, say in public that there was one RSS leader who did support the demolition. That was Moropant Pingle. So he dissented from the softer line of the RSS BJP in general. And he supported he made sure that at least these Karsevaks were there. And so when they started the demolition, Narasingha Rao executed his Chanakya type strategy to allow them the demolition, but meanwhile put the BJP in the dock, blaming the BJP for the demolition. So on the one hand, he supported the demolition. On the other, he used it as a political tool to put the BJP on the defensive. And so he could sack the 4 BJP Pradesh governments. So that was the strategic mind of Narasingha Rao. If you want, if anti-Brahmin campaigners want a very good illustration of the wily Brahmin mind, well, Narasingha Rao is an excellent example.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for not calling him vicious, but Wiley was okay.
Just a supplementary here. Just a supplementary. Is that the reason that the entire RSS BJP lot went into a defensive mode and started recalibrating their strategy towards Muslims and started calling that Sarva Samadar Manch and started calling this Wahiduddin Ahmad Khan and started saying that, that same DNA theory originated at that time. Am I correct?
Well, it only reconfirmed and strengthened or aggravated a mentality that had already grown since the Mahatma Gandhi murder. You see, the Mahatma Gandhi murder was committed by a Hindu Mahasabha member individually or with a few conspirators. But at any rate, it was not the Hindu Mahasabha nor the RSS that wanted to kill Gandhi. You see, that's one of the probably intended mistakes that the secularists keep on making. They say, oh, it was a Hindutva fellow who committed the murder, therefore the whole Hindutva movement is responsible for the murder. That's not the case at all. I mean, as organizations, they of course also calculated their self-interest, which would not be served by the murder. And effectively, that's what happened. There was a total crackdown on these organizations. The Hindu Mahasabha has not really restored itself after that. The RSS has, but becoming already a bit less Hindu and entering the path of becoming ever less Hindu after that. Then you see, for instance, in the 60s, there was some protest against Jawaharlal Nehru. There was a lot of anger at his mishandling the crisis with the Chinese invasion. At that time, Sitaram Goel was writing a series of articles in The Organizer criticizing Nehru. That was suddenly stopped on orders of the RSS leadership. Why? Because they calculated, okay, we criticized Gandhi. When Gandhi got murdered, we got to blame. So now if something happens to Nehru, and there are these articles by Goel as so-called proof, then we will also get the blame. So they avoided that. And ever since, they have been retreating farther and farther from their original pro-Hindu positions. And so another instance of it is during the Ayodhya crisis. First, the Ayodhya movement is a non-BJP movement, non-RSS movement. A major agent of it was Mahant Avaidhyanath, the personal guru of the present UP Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath. He was the last member of parliament for the Hindu Mahasabha. Then there were several Congress politicians involved, most importantly Gulzari Lal Nanda, who had been an interim prime minister sometime in the late 60s. So it was not a BJP RSS movement at that time, but it became so progressively in the late 80s. And so it really greatly profited them. You know, there was a Hindu mobilization that effectively translated into electoral gains for the BJP. But once they had harvested those gains, after the elections of 1991, they pulled their hands off the whole case. And in fact, that is one of the reasons for the demolition. You see, the gathering of the Karsevaks at the site on 6 December 92 had been announced, had been planned beforehand. And so two things were going to happen. The BJP, of course, was expected to support them. Everybody said so. Their enemies were saying so, internationally, but especially nationally. The Times of India and so on were always accusing the BJP of being Hindu fanatical and so on. Secondly, there was the Supreme Court. You see, they had promised to take a decision before the 6th of December, and they didn't do so. So neither the BJP nor the Supreme Court meant business. That's what the Karsevaks concluded. So they said, well, if they're not going to do it, we are going to do it. And so then they took the law into their own hands and demolished the contentious structure. And so the BJP has never really had a course correction on this. Essentially, they have never returned to, well, embracing the Ayodhya issue. And so it is the courts that then took it up. Well, to some extent, it was again the Congress that took it up. You see, Narasimha Rao went with his one-point reference to the Supreme Court, which concerned the issue whether there had been a temple there beforehand. Like Rajiv Gandhi before him, Narasimha Rao publicly stated that, and you have to be careful with public statements, especially in the case of Narasimha Rao, he was a bit duplicitous. But anyway, in this case, I'm pretty sure he meant it. You see, both Rajiv Gandhi and Narasimha Rao wanted the decision whether to build a temple or not to be made dependent on the historical question whether there had been a temple there beforehand. Now, that's a veiled way of saying, I want a temple there. Because, of course, everybody knew, except for the eminent historians who supposedly claim to know the opposite, but everybody knew that, of course, there was a temple there. Like, I myself wrote a little book at the time, in 1990, Ram Janmabhoomi versus Babri Masjid, case study of Hindu-Muslim conflict. And so that was news, that was on, you see, the presentation of that book was on the front page of many Indian newspapers. And yet, you see, that was not a special book. I didn't say anything really original. There was a bit of a narrative stringing together a number of facts that had not been done. But the facts, you see, the evidence presented there was already present. Indian scholars like B.B. Lal, for example, S.P. Gupta, Harsh Narayan, and so on, they had already brought to the fore quite a bit of evidence. You see, but the special thing was only that I didn't toe the line of the international Indologists, who in turn meekly towed the line of the Indian secularists, namely to claim that in spite of everybody saying the opposite for hundreds of years, suddenly they had evidence that there had never been a temple there. Now, of course, everybody knew that there had been a temple there. Now it is court certified, it is archaeologist certified, and so on. But back then, essentially, we also knew. Okay.
I was coming back with another thought on this, is that the contemporary India, there is so much of a heat generated on this entire issue. And that heat is generated, people are talking, lecturing, advising, sermonizing, only the Hindus to maintain calm. Even so much so that even a very popular spiritual guide and teacher called Sadhguru requested that let the bygones be bygones, let the past be past, and sort it out between the two groups of people. Now, this is what bothered me about his comment, is that we always sermonize the Hindus who are most compliant, who are willing to give an inch or a foot to buy peace or have peace, but nobody dare advise those who have perpetrated the crime in history. So is it something like a conquering of the primitive culture that badger them, bludgeon them, and they will definitely be cowed down, to use the pun unintended? Where does the Hindu go from here? Because you look at the laws made during Congress Party and everybody else. Some people are crediting Narasimha Rao with a genius of including the clause of 100-year-old monument that can be opened up. So, these are issues which are very important. And current generation of Hindus are feeling badgered. And the law of physics will operate, whether it is equal or opposite reaction or not, but there will be reaction.
Yeah, well, this Places of Worship Act has a lot of interesting juridical loopholes. For that, you will have to consult a juridical specialist. I don't want to speak out in detail about that.
Yes, I have a fair idea, and I've already done a couple of episodes on that. Yes.
Mhm.
And I'm also challenging it legally in the
Yes,
Supreme Court.
Right,
congratulations.
right.
That's right.
Now, of course, in principle, there shouldn't be such a law, simply because it denies Hindus
Um, uh,
the
just
pleasures of
quickly,
independence.
if I may give you the
Yeah.
latest, I wonder if you've noticed what the Supreme Court observed the other day when the matter went up to them. Because the section 4 1 4 section 4 subsection 1, it says that the religious character as on 15th August 1947 will remain the same. And then
Mhm.
section 3 says that there is a bar on conversion of a religious place from one denomination to another or from one religion to another. These are the two basic sections that cause a bar. And the contention of the plaintiffs in the lower court was that the religious character cannot be presupposed. The religious character of a place has to be determined by lending evidence. So, seemingly, the Supreme Court agreed with that, and they made a remark that the determination of the religious character is not precluded or forbidden or banned under Section 3. And within Section 4, also, they said that there are a lot of nuances because there are a lot of exceptions given within Section 4 of the subsection 3A, B, C. Those are all exceptions,
Mhm.
and those exceptions apply. For instance, in Mathura, one of those exceptions has made the suit live because that suit had earlier been rejected. But then in revision, the uh, revisional court, the district and sessions judge, he has held that in the Mathura court, in the Mathura case, the exceptions under 4.3b is applicable. And they are also claiming that in Varanasi case, the exception under 4.3a is also applicable, other than the fact that the religious character of the place has to be determined through evidence and not through just an assertion that, okay, since it was Islamic, so it will remain Islamic. You have to determine whether it was actually Islamic. And then there are laws. You see, my challenge to the Places of Worship Act, in fact, is based on those laws. There are laws by constitutional benches that say that once a deity acquires a right in a place and it is consecrated, then it is forever because the deity is immortal.
Mhm.
Deity, there can be no adverse possession against the deity, and there is no limitation on that property. So even if the idol is stolen or broken or spirited away, whatever happens, the pran lives on, and you can consecrate another deity over there with that same prana.
Mhm.
So that is the basic law. So if that being the basic law, actually, if you can see that Muslims basically have no case, and they can keep harping on the Places of Worship Act, but it won't stand.
Yes, as Subramaniam Swami also pointed out a few times, there's also a difference in status between Hindu temples and mosques, in the sense that a mosque doesn't hold anything sacred except the Kaaba in Mecca, which has the black stone. It's just a gathering place for prayer, and prayers can, in principle, be said anywhere. Now, with Hindu temples, that is often also the case, like you
Um,
see
I-
in
I'll
the
tell you this
yeah.
this particular what Subramaniam Swami is saying is actually a law laid down in the Ismail Faruqi case. Ismail
All right.
Faruqi case is the
Mhm.
one that was contested against the acquisition of Ayodhya properties and
Mhm.
abatement of cases relating to Ayodhya. So that was also upheld by the court, but only
Mhm.
certain portion regarding abatement of cases was invalidated using the what is called the doctrine of severability. And the rest of the major portion of that act was validated, and
Mhm.
that also included this assertion, which is basically the Mohammedan law. You can see that famous book by Mullah, on Hindu
Yeah.
law as well as on Muslim law. Din Shah Mullah is the ultimate authority. So in India, the Muslim law is that the mosque does not even have an integral place in Islam.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Now, in the case of Hindu temples, you see, for some Hindu temples, that would be true too, and that can be used then to justify, for example, the clearing of Hindu temples that stand in the way of new roads or modern projects. But in many Hindu temples, it is the place itself that is sacred, and so they can't be moved. And so in the case of, for example, the Krishna Janmabhoomi case that is now coming up, it's obvious Krishna can only be born at one place. About that, there's something else that I'd like to highlight. In the case of Ayodhya, there has been contention about whether Rama was really born there. There have been very flimsy, silly claims about him being born in Afghanistan or many other funny places. But you see, at least, him being born in Ayodhya still doesn't determine the matter because, first of all, Ayodhya is a big place. Secondly, a case could be made that Ayodhya has been rediscovered, so to speak, by Vikramaditya after it had been abandoned by its population shortly after Rama's death. And that perhaps either because he didn't know better or maybe because he had some political plans with this, maybe he has chosen another side as Ayodhya. And so the Jains who knew from scriptures that their Tirthankaras were born in Ayodhya placed those birthplaces there only at random, not knowing whether they had been really born there. And similar with Rama. Okay, so that's a case that has been made. It could be countered, like, for instance, Valmiki didn't know exactly the right measurements of those places. So if they are not the same as those in today's Ayodhya, it can be simply his mistake rather than Vikramaditya's mistake, and so on. I mean, this is a long discussion. I only mean to say, ultimately, this is in short. Same thing for Krishna. In his case, there is no reason to doubt that he was born exactly there. But even then, in the strong sense of the term, you can't say that this is proven, that there is evidence for this. I mean, how can you prove that somebody 4,000 years ago was born here rather than there? If there's a plaque, oh, this morning here Prince Rama was born, or Krishna was born, that doesn't prove it. I mean, on the contrary, you see, if you see that kind of thing, it's probable, that the locals wanted to attract tourists or something by making such a claim. So, strictly speaking, this is all not exactly proven. I mean, it is conventional, and secular governments the world over go by these conventions. Like, for instance, the French government doesn't usually believe that the Virgin Mary appeared in Lourdes, yet it facilitates, finances Catholic pilgrimages to Lourdes. The Israeli government doesn't believe that Jesus was laid to rest for 2 days in the Holy Sepulchre, of which the location was revealed in a dream to Emperor Constantine's mother. But nevertheless, since it exists like that, it protects the existing pilgrimage. So simply, the exact place where the birth must have happened, is not the concern of secular governments. They just accept the pilgrimage as it is. But if you really want to be difficult, you can question that exact place of birth. However, I would not counsel Muslims or pro-Islamic secularists to do that. Because if you do that, then you have to question the birthplace of Muhammad. Why are Muslims going to Mecca? Because to them, Mecca is a very important place. Adam and Eve have landed there, coming from paradise. Then Abraham lived there and built the Kaaba there, according to Islamic tradition. Then Muhammad was born there and received his revelations there. Now, recent research shows that Mecca during Muhammad's lifetime didn't exist. You see, whenever modern builders start a new project, you see the archaeologists flock to there because they know these builders are going to dig up, you know, clear the whole place. And if there are any artifacts of an old city, they're going to be found. Not perhaps in a archaeologically professional manner, but still they're going to be found. They're going to be very useful for archaeologists. Now, in the case of Mecca, the Saudi government has done all kinds of public works at the site, and the archaeologists have found nothing there. There was nothing there. And by contrast, a scholar called Dan Gibson has shown that many places described in the Quran or in the life of the Prophet do exist or have existed, but in Petra, in Jordania, which is hundreds of kilometers to the north, near Jerusalem. And so the going to Mecca is really based on a mistake. You see, if at all you want to go on pilgrimage to these places, you ought to go to Petra. Therefore, if you care about the exact birth site of someone, then the whole idea of supporting and facilitating and financing or subsidizing the pilgrimage to Mecca also comes under fire, and in a far more decisive way than the uncertainties surrounding Mathura or Ayodhya. Right? So, I mean, if you see the global picture, then I think the Hindu case for their sacred sites is pretty good.
Right. So I think.
Can I just ask one small question before we shift to question answer?
Yes. Before that, let me just request all the viewers, please shoot your questions, because after Vibhuti Ji asks his questions, we're going to straight into the audience round.
Koenraad, Dr. Koenraad, what I wanted to we are talking about evidence. We are living in an era in which everybody demands evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the very key resources to establish an evidence is DNA. Today, we are even trying to figure out the DNA of animals that don't exist.
Yeah.
So the question here is very simple.
Mm-hmm.
Can the DNA testing prove something? There is an element to that. What is the recent or the latest evidence that we can collect on DNA? Because Hindus are not demanding evidence. They want reclaiming all the temples which have been destroyed. And there is enough evidence for that.
Mm-hmm.
If we go by evidence. There is other people are not even going on the DNA test or the evidence part of it. They say it is my right. I have done it. There is a law and that's mine. There is a serious dichotomy in my thought that this is what is plaguing the entire conversation and dispute.
Mm-hmm.
How do we address that? Can we take, in New York, for
Yes.
example, if somebody was released after 15 years being in prison because the DNA test proved that he was not the killer. He was falsely implicated and put behind bars. So if we are able to rectify such scenarios, can the DNA testing prove things that are so-called unproven?
Yes, I mean, even when a person is already dead, often genetics can still make a difference. Like you then collect the genome of his children or his siblings or so, and they still contain a certain percentage of the same DNA, and they can then be used to determine whether the deceased person, perhaps, for instance, was the father of some other person or was implicated in a crime, for example. Now, for 1 or 2 generations, that is still feasible. If you talk about Rama or Krishna, you're speaking about hundreds of generations. And there, I am sorry to say, I don't think that genetics can make much difference. I mean, there are still people who claim to be descendants from Lava and Kusha, or the 2 sons of Rama. Given the number of women that Krishna had, there must be numerous descendants of Krishna. But you see, this is so many generations that I think genetically this type of evidence is not that useful anymore. In the case of India as a whole, it is useful in the sense that you can, oh my God.
Hello.
It was a tough question,
Yes.
Janet.
Yes, hello, can you see me?
We can
We
see
can hear
you.
you all right.
Okay, then I'll continue. It's just that here my video has disappeared. Anyway, I know where you people are, so I'll keep talking to you. Okay,
Yes,
so
please.
about genetics. So for the Indian population as a whole, genetics, of course, is interesting. Like you have nowadays, you see genetics brought up in the Aryan Invasion debate. And this could be interesting insofar that it confirms that there have been a number of immigrations from Central Asia, but we knew that already.
Right. I think. Can you hear us, Dr. Elst? I think now even his voice has disappeared. Okay, let me see if we can manage with the questions while he reappears.
He will.
Okay, Milind Joshi, Naman to the Gurus, STNKE. Thanks for making the talk happen. Question: is there a heightened risk of terrorism from global Islamic outfits after temple reclamation in India, or are they apathetic to it? Oh well, they always need an excuse. They'll need this excuse or that excuse, but right now all the terrorists are focused on Islamabad, if you know what is going on there. So you will have only the homegrown madrasa types right now.
The homegrown madrasa type and the Leli gangs, the Panchmakar gang, who are the Rana Ayubs and the other gang people who will keep raking up the issue. There is a particular design behind raking up this issue, is to show to the world that Muslims are not safe in India anymore. Welcome back, sir.
I think Koenraad back. Okay, next question. QWERTY. Namaste. Since we are talking about OIT and Indian history, question regarding Mahabharata.
Yes.
Did people outside of India take part in that war? One Indian author has claimed Russia and Mongolia fought for Kauravas under Karna's banner. Genghis Khan and Mongolians are followers of Karna.
Well, that is a very tall order. I don't see those Russians or Mongolians there anywhere. But I agree that my knowledge of the Mahabharata is much less thorough than by many Indians. So, but I haven't noticed. No. Anyway, I don't expect genetics to contribute much to that because the Mahabharata is only a text. It's not an archaeological corpus. It's not a number of corpses or so on which we could do DNA testing. So I'm afraid that their genetics can't help. Have foreigners participated in this? Well, India is a large place, and you see, travel was not that easy at the time. So, except for Afghanistan, where Gandhari came from, I don't expect so now.
Oh yes, Vallika, that is Balkh, that also is there.
Okay, yeah, well, that's also Afghanistan. So, it is more or less part of the subcontinent. And so I don't think any factor from outside the subcontinent is
two more
involved.
areas. The one is the Uttar Kuru. Uttar Kuru is the present Uyghur area. And the Uttar Madhya is more of the what is called the Central Asian part. So all these places are mentioned there. And Professor Subhash Kak has made a very interesting research into it and established that Uttar Kuru and Uttar Madhya are basically the lands of present East Turkestan or Xinjiang and the present Central Asian, the what is called the main the Turkestan proper. So that is an interesting theory that people can look at. Next. QWERTY. Gandhi was a British MI6 agent sent to hijack the Indian freedom movement. Let's just stop pretending he was a traitor. What do you say, Dr. Elst?
Well, I've written about the whole Gandhi case, and he was a traitor. I don't know. I mean, he was not very good for Hindus, but you should not underestimate the factor of um, things happening against your intention. You know, I don't think there was a plan behind the career of Mahatma Gandhi. You see, to say that he was sent to India as a British agent, not that it would have made much difference because he was at heart very pro-British. And so whether he was, you know, paid by some central agency or not, you see, he would have acted the way he did anyway. And I don't think that by adding these conspiracies to the story, much is gained, and often credibility is lost. So I'd explain the Gandhi phenomenon without these British machinations. He was already pro-British anyway, as many Indians were. Let's not forget. You see, no matter how many crimes the British committed, for some people individually, they were helpful. And like, for instance, in the 90s, I've interviewed Neeraj Chaudhary, this Bengali intellectual who had moved to Britain and who deplored independence. Or like a far more famous case, Dr. Ambedkar. He was against independence. He thought it a calamity if the British were to leave. See, so you see, this existed, and so to some extent, Gandhi was part of this phenomenon. And we don't need the Secret Service for that.
Okay. Next. Harshad Malve. I am Baudhya, Linyardi, Karla, caves, etc. in Maharashtra turned into temples. I don't oppose because lack of both the defense it was needed. Stupas and lanis weren't destroyed. I think it's the same argument that
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Elst presented about the Mahabodhi temple.
Yeah. Well, you
Next.
know, destroyed is something else than taken over. And so here first I'd have to verify the facts. Um, like I read about, I read something from this Dalrymple, this British writer residing in Delhi, where he takes the case of one Hindu temple in Orissa, claiming that it was built on stupas. But you know that can only be written by somebody who doesn't know what a stupa looks like. You can't just turn a stupa into a temple. You can like integrate it in new temple architecture, perhaps. But the traditional story, you see, supported by documents, is that there was a stupa nearby and that it is the some pillar, no, the Shiva Lingam that was already a pillar and part of a Buddhist temple. I think that that's about the story. Now you see here all kinds of scenarios are possible, but it's clearly not that Hindus moved in and destroyed the Buddhist temple. You see, they may have later integrated something Buddhist. You see, when there were no Buddhists around anymore to use them anyway. But you know, here, I mean, I'd have to look into the details of that particular case. Thank you.
In any case, when it comes to Buddhist temples and Hindu temples, and there are so many symbols and there's so many things that are very, very common to both. And it
Yeah.
becomes very difficult to even distinguish. Because, for instance, I've seen Dhammachakra in a number of Hindu temples. And if you go to Thailand, I think every temple has a lot of Hindu gods. In fact, Ganesha is ubiquitous.
Hmm.
So it's very difficult. It's not the case of a mosque and a temple, which is absolutely it's black and white.
Yeah.
Between a Buddhist temple and a Hindu temple, there's so many gray shades. That's a factor that's always to be kept in
Mm.
mind.
Right.
Next. India, naman to all of you. What was the lifespan of common people in great and rich Maurya Gupta Pratihara Empire existed before 10th century?
That's a bit off topic.
That's certainly not at 200 and 300 years. There's no such evidence. Next. दीपक सिंह, नमस्ते गुरुजी। अपने सनातनी योद्धा की चरण वंदना स्वीकार करें। सनातनी वैदिक संस्कृति और धर्म की सदैव जय। धन्यवाद आपको दीपक सिंह जी, बहुत बहुत आपको धन्यवाद। थैंक यू सो
And he
मच।
said it very well. He wrote it very well. Thank you very much, sir.
I don't disagree.
And then with that, we come to the end of this show. And thank you so much, Dr. Elst. Thank you, Vibhuti Ji.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you. Thank you.
Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.
Jai Hind, Vande Mataram. Koenraad, I will call you later.
Okay, Vibhuti Jha, looking forward to it.
Yes,
Sanjay, अगली बार फिर मिलेंगे.
फिर मिलेंगे.
Thank you. I'm sure you're meeting Vibhuti Ji in New York.
We'll coordinate that. We'll definitely coordinate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.